And we are back to Dan Celia's Financial Issues. Fred and Jeremy sitting in again today for Dan. You know, I like the state of California. I get to visit there about once a year or so down in Orange County, which is known as one of the most conservative counties, certainly in California, Orange County, that area of the world.
I like Disneyland.
Disneyland, that whole area in there, a lot of big churches in that area, well known for all of that. But California is also known in this country for coming up with some of the wackiest / perhaps we should consider most dangerous pieces of legislation out there. And even more so in recent days, very hostile to Christian values. And one of the groups that is fighting and standing up to this is the Pacific Justice Institute. And we have the head of the Pacific Justice Institute on the line right now, our good friend Brad Dacus. Brad, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you. It's always a pleasure.
We have you up early this morning, Brad.
Oh, no, I've got two young kids. They get me up earlier.
Well, I got to tell you, Brad Dacus and the Pacific Justice Institute do a great job. I was actually out a few weeks ago, part of your celebration of justice.
Yes.
With John Bolton was the guest speaker there, and ran into some people, and they were talking about some of this legislation that you are speaking up about right now. And one of them has to do with would outlaw reparatory therapy, in other words, counseling people about their ability, if they so choose, to leave the homosexual lifestyle.
Yeah, it's SB 1172. It's a new law that went into effect January 1st. And what it does is it actually bans anyone under the age of 18 who is having struggles with same-sex attraction from getting any counseling from anywhere in California, from any licensed counselor, including clergy who are licensed counselors, that in any way where the counseling in any way steers them away from same-sex attraction, or even, get this, steers them away from same-sex sexual activities that they may be engaging in. It is a sick, demented piece of legislation. I don't use those words all the time, but in that it in a cold-hearted way denies young people who want to get counseling. You know, in an early adolescence, same-sex attraction issues or confusion is not that uncommon, and you know, you've got these young people in their adolescence. Sexual orientation is still very fluid, according to Kaiser Permanente, all the way up through well into adulthood, and yet this law prohibits them from getting any counseling that in any way will steer them away from same-sex attraction.
Well, Brad, I just want to make it very clear to our audience. So this is the law now.
Right. This is the law. Now, we at Pacific Justice Institute didn't take this lightly by any means. We went into federal court. We filed for a motion for preliminary injunction, which is a sort of a stopgap to prevent it from going into full effect. And a federal judge, to the shock of the Attorney General of California, went ahead and granted, in a 38-page opinion, our motion for preliminary injunction on behalf of our clients. And now it's pending before an interlocutory appeal pending before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals as to whether or not our preliminary injunction is going to stand while we wait for a full trial on the merits in the lower federal court.
So the extent of this, you make mention of this would outlaw even a pastor of a church in California would be breaking the law if this law is allowed to go forward into effect.
Yeah, if they are a licensed counselor, and many of them are, and many churches have counseling ministries with licensed, trained counselors, they are completely prohibited. Now, if they're not a licensed counselor, they're not trained in counseling, then they're not covered by this. But the sad truth is, young people, I believe young people, particularly young people of faith, should be able to have a licensed counselor who is not in disagreement with their foundational faith and understands them with their faith and accommodates them because of their faith. This legislation, they have to choose between either a licensed counselor who's going to steer them away from their faith or a pastor who's going to counsel them but is not trained and may give some bad advice and some bad direction.
Brad, another bill that's working its way through the California legislature right now is Senate Bill 323, which threatens to revoke tax exemptions from the Boy Scouts and other nonprofits if they do not affirm transgender or homosexual lifestyles. Tell us a little bit about that Senate bill.
Yeah, this is called the Anti-Boy Scout Bill. in that it explicitly mentions the Boy Scouts, the 4-H clubs, Special Olympics, even could potentially applies to the Young Life, Youth for Christ. There's no exemption for religious youth groups. And what it says is that if they do not, if they're not willing to hire homosexual or transsexual youth leaders, then they will lose their state tax-exempt status, meaning people who donate to them will no longer be able to write that off their state income taxes, and any donations they receive will be taxed as income, as if they were a for-profit company, which would basically gut and put out of business just about every nonprofit youth organization serving the youth in inner cities and other places throughout California, simply because they're not willing to placate and have leaders that they feel would be harmful for so many young people looking for role models.
Brad, there's a third piece of legislation. I want to get to that in a moment, but just with these two that you've just talked about, one comes to the conclusion, being an observer from this side of the country, that homosexual activists and their friends basically have gone to the legislators, Governor Brown and others there, and said, this is what we want from you. And the Democrats, and maybe even some Republicans, you can clarify that for us, have said, whatever you want, we'll give it to you.
That is correct. And basically every Democrat in the state legislature, and they almost have about two-thirds majority now in the state assembly, state senate, we anticipate will support this. They have to have two-thirds vote, because this is dealing with a tax issue. So our only hope is to peel away one of those Democrats. But make no mistake, the Democrat leadership in California is resolutely lockstep behind a very oppressive, radical LGBT movement, which that's what this legislation is. People talk about, homosexual marriage. This legislation, prohibiting counseling, anti-Boy Scouts, and shutting down these groups. This is much worse than homosexual marriage. This is outright oppression and tyranny against people and groups of faith who want to simply, in their own private lives, live and practice their faith, or in their own private organization.
Well, there's one more, and we have to talk about this, Assembly Bill 1266.
Yeah, this one's unbelievable. This one's outright unbelievable.
Tell us about
it. What this does is it says to every public school in California, K through 12 grade level, that if there's a boy and he goes to school and he decides that he feels like a girl that day, then he's allowed to use the girl restroom, go in and change in the girls' locker room, even use the girls' showers with girls there. There's no exemption in this legislation for privacy rights of the opposite gender, because everyone is supposed to treat them and assume that if they feel like they're a female, that they are a female for every practical purposes, even though looking in the shower, the girls will be able to clearly tell that he's not a female. This is pending, and it also allows the boy to play on the girls' athletic teams, and which could also be applicable for scholarships and college admissions and things like that. So this legislation, and it applies to girls wanting to go in the boys, change in the boys' locker rooms as well. It's very likely to pass because it only requires a majority, and we believe that the radical LGBT movement clearly has enough the Democrat majority to get this to become law, but then we're counting on Governor Jerry Brown, maybe to veto it. But that's really hard to rely upon, unfortunately.
Brad, this one in particular, when I read about this, my thinking was even some liberal mums and dads have got to be upset about the idea. I mean, they can be as left-wing Democrat, card-carrying Democrats, but do they really feel, even these liberals, content to allow, let's say they have daughters in public school there, content to be exposed, translate that whatever way you want, exposed to this kind of thing? Is there an outcry even from some liberal groups there?
Not yet. Unfortunately, there really is not. And, of course, the media doesn't help us. The mainstream media doesn't help us much on the left coast with regards to these kinds of issues. So many people don't even know about it, unfortunately. But definitely, you'd think that the average parent, I agree, the average parent, even if they're with a liberal bent, just out of love and compassion for their own daughter, for example, or their own son, would say, enough is enough, this is harmful to my child. The emperor has no clothes philosophy isn't going to work for this family. We know better, and that we know it's going to be harmful to our daughter to have to shower with a boy, or vice versa, or to change in a locker room or use a bathroom with the opposite gender. But many of them aren't aware of it. But this is how depraved, how perverted. Once again, that strong language. But I think it's appropriate here. How our legislators, not just the legislation, but our legislators are in the majority in the state of California, and it's unfortunate because so much of California is not like this at all, and yet it's very disappointing.
Brett, a lot of people keep an eye on California because so California goes, so does so many other laws around the United States. But talk to us for a second what the conditions for children in the school systems are already facing. I mean, they're already subject to so many things that have to deal with the homosexual agenda that this just continues on a path of insanity.
Yeah, it does. It clearly does. For example, it's already the law in California that virtually every social science and history textbook in California will have to be modified to include homosexual role models and transsexual role models in history. I say alleged transsexual and homosexual because it is very speculative, because in history this isn't something that people would brag about and be proud of. So that's going to be required at all grade levels, all the way down to kindergarten level. They already have also transsexual orientation sensitivity programs. For example, in Oakland, in one school district, the Redwood Heights Elementary School, there was transsexuals came in to kindergarten and first grade classes to teach the boys and girls how they can be a boy on the outside, but be a girl on the inside, and that's okay. How they can be a boy, a girl, both, or neither. End quote. Kindergartners and first graders. And this was with a grant from the California Teachers Association, the teachers union, because they are a huge force in pushing and supporting this kind of twisted indoctrination that is so rampant in California schools. And that's what they use the teachers union dues for, and that's one reason why we at Pacific Justice Institute defend the rights of every union worker in America, including in California, to have all their dues no longer go to their union, but instead go to a charity of their choice instead of their union, because of these kinds of actions that violate the beliefs of so many Christians in public service.
Brad, I'm sure there are people listening to this program saying, boy, I'm glad I don't live in California. But that's dangerous to be content because I'm sure you can see evidence from various jurisdictions across the country that many other states are moving in this direction, and that's why we want to bring this to people's attention across the country today. Don't ever say this couldn't happen in my state, because California has perhaps leading the way, and that's maybe the wrong way to put it, leading the way down. But this can happen anywhere, and our culture is just preparing people, it seems today. Our anti-biblical, anti-God culture is setting people up for this kind of legislation across the country.
Yeah, it is being set up. Even programs like HGTV on House Hunters, every, I think, fifth or sixth episode has this homosexuality brought into it. It's a continual bombardment across the country. And make no mistake, we understand that this legislation, SB 1172, is already being offered in 3 other states, being pushed. This other legislation will be pushed in other states. And it's only a matter of time if we don't stop it here. It's sort of like the hand looking at the foot that's turning infected and green, gangrene, saying, gee, I'm glad I'm not a part of the foot. The bottom line, this whole country will go down eventually if we don't stop it and address it, firmly and straightforwardly.
Brad, we're so thankful for groups like yours, Pacific Justice Institute, out on the front lines on this one in California. We're going to be praying for you, my friend.
Thank you very
as you
much.
Continue these battles.
I appreciate that. And if people would like to keep up with this work or like to receive our press releases and or get behind our work, they can do that very easily by going to our website, pacificjustice.org. pacificjustice.org, pacificjustice.org, and we'd love to get out this information. And I also do a lot of guest preaching at churches without charge as well, because we really want to open the eyes of believers as to what's happening.
Thank you, brother. We sure appreciate you.
Thank you. Keep up the good work.
All right, Brad Dacus, head of the Pacific Justice Institute. And again, Jeremy, the reason why we talked to Brad today isn't to pick on California. That's not the reason. It is to warn our listeners across the country that this is the real agenda of homosexual activists. They're getting their way in California. Brad Dacus and others are out there fighting this, but this can happen in any jurisdiction across the country.
Well, and especially California has to be looked at so closely because they have I don't think people really realize how many people live in California. There's a ton of people in California, which means that when you look at their representation in the House, they get a large chunk because of their population. So what happens in California has its way of making it into the national debate as well.
888-589-8840, 888-589-8840. We certainly have discussed a whole lot of items today. I know you want to comment on them. 888-589-8840, 888-589-8840. We're going to go to our phones in about 3 minutes.